Support for this podcast comes from Bryn Mawr Communications. BMC produces a number of informative podcast series spanning a variety of topics in ophthalmology. Discover a new show at itube.net/podcasts. Support for this podcast comes from Notal Vision, a patient-centric ophthalmic diagnostic services company extending age-related macular degeneration monitoring from the clinic to the home, providing optometrists with remote diagnostic tools to support their patient care. Managed by the Notal Vision Diagnostic Clinic, the ForeseeHome program helps detect wet AMD conversion as early as possible.
My name is Damon Dierker. I'm here with my colleagues to talk about AMD management and use of ForeseeHome and the Notal Vision Diagnostic Clinic in particular. I am Director of Optometric Services at Eye Surgeons of Indiana and currently President of the Indiana Optometric Association. I've got three of my colleagues here from across the country, different practice types. I want to go ahead and introduce them before we get started into our conversation. Dr. Mary Eiden, why don't you tell us about yourself, your practice, and your experience with the Notal Vision program?
Sure, Damon. Thanks, everybody, for having me join you today. And we practice in the Chicago area, in the suburbs of Chicago. Practice is called North Suburban Vision Consultants. We're a group practice with 5 ODs and 3 MDs. It is an OD-driven, OD-owned practice. And multi-specialty practice, to be honest with you. And we do a lot of primary care, a lot of anterior segment disease. We do a lot of retina in terms of diagnostics and managing with local retina specialists as well. So as it relates to the topic for this evening, I think the perspective that we're going to bring to the group is more of a primary care environment. So I hope that that really does resonate with a lot of the folks who are listening to the podcast. We were involved with Notal Vision for quite some time, actually, probably even before they were called Notal Vision. We've been utilizing the Home 4C technology for years now and have found it to resonate with our approach in a comprehensive management of age-related macular degeneration.
Thanks, Mary. I'm excited to have you here. And I think that primary care aspect really is one of the main points here is these patients are in our optometric clinics and we need to be providing the very best care that we can so that patients have good outcomes. Dr. Dorothy Hitchmoth, let us know about your experience with the technology and a little bit about your practice.
Sure. And again, thanks so much for having me. It's really a privilege to be here speaking with all of you and having the opportunity to share my experience with the technology that Notal has put out. So I've been in practice for 24 years. I was the Director of Residency Programs and Chief of Service for 22 years at VA New England. My academic focus was on neuroretinal disease and systemic biomarkers. And I actually had the privilege of working with the VA Dartmouth Outcomes Group, which is a nationally recognized program at this point, looking to figure out, what are the things that we need to deliver to patients to improve their quality of life and outcomes. So that's been part of my soul since my academic days, which didn't end all that long ago. I retired a couple years ago and expanded my 2-location rural private practice. I have a healthcare consulting business as well. So I have a keen interest in ophthalmic product development and that sort of thing. But really working in a rural area for my entire practice, for my entire career, quite frankly, means that I have to manage patients right up to the OR door or right up to the needle, as I say, because there are just simply not enough ophthalmologists to cover some of the more advanced disease patients. So yes, I do primary care all the time, but I also receive referrals from other ODs and quite frankly, even some other ophthalmologists. And so we're seen as one of the practices that really is trying to do right by the patients in terms of prevention. And in fact, that's the mission at my practice is prevention of vision loss. So really Notal fits right in with with my own passion and our practice mission. And my first experience with the technology was actually before it even became part of the Home Foresee. A retina colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Jerome Sherman at NYU, actually introduced me to the in-clinic version of this technology probably 6 to 8 years ago. I don't even know exactly anymore. So when I saw the much more developed home version of the technology, I was really, really excited because I realized, oh my God, this is something that could really help patients.
Thank you, Dorothy. I think your experience in various settings is going to bring a lot to this conversation. So I'm looking forward to hearing your experiences with No-Tal Vision and ForeseeHome. And finally, Mary Beth Yackey, a little bit closer to me in Cincinnati. Tell us a little bit about your practice and why and how long you've been using ForeseeHome for your patients with AMD.
So I love my practice just like everybody else is passionate about their practice. I have a very unique situation where I work at Cincinnati Eye Institute directly in the retina department. So at Cincinnati Eye Institute, we have approximately 100 doctors, approximately 80 ophthalmologists, and we're going on 20 optometrists plus and growing. Privileged to be in the retina group specifically. So I love No-Tal Vision and what it's brought to our practice. And I've been using it now for approximately 2 years. ForeseeHome devices really changed the way that I take care of my patients to help manage their early stages of macular degeneration, and really helps us to guide our patients on when they need to come in. And it's really been game changing for us. I started actually honestly using it on my mother. So my first experience was with my mom, and then from there grew into using it for patients.
Awesome. Looking forward to hear everyone's experience with the technology and their patient success stories. And I think this is such a timely topic because optometry really can have a huge impact on patient outcomes when it comes to AMD. Mary Beth, I'm going to start with you with our first topic, really, because you're in a setting where you're working right along with the retina specialists and seeing patients having anti-VEGF injections. Why is early detection of AMD when it converts from dry to wet, why is that so important when it comes to patient outcomes?
So it's so important to have early treatment. With what we have seen is the sooner you can get treatment with anti-VEGF on wet AMD, the sooner and the better the vision will hopefully return to where we're hoping 2040, that functional vision. We can't always achieve that, but the quicker that we get the treatment on board, the more likely we can keep from a fibrotic scar forming, which is really detrimental to the vision. So the sooner you catch the wet change, the better the likelihood is that we can actually stop up that fluid, and maybe even with less number of treatments long term.
No, I agree completely. And the reality is we're not really doing a good job either in optometry or ophthalmology catching these patients early. If you look at the data, real world data of what's happening, we know that when patients in the US start getting their first anti-VEGF injection for wet AMD, their average acuity is 20/80. Dorothy, we have all this great technology with OCT, with dark adaptation. This imaging has improved. Why is 20/80? Why are we at that point in the year 2020 where people are having lost 6 or 7 lines of vision before they even get treated for their wet AMD?
Thanks for actually saying that. We have all this great advanced technology, and I actually have a Zeiss Concept office, so I've got all the latest bells and whistles that we know are important for early detection of macular degeneration, whether it's FAF or OCTA. But those tools are only good if we're actually examining the patient in the office. At least that's what we have available now. And so this really is an extension of advanced diagnostics to the patient home, right? I am obsessed at this point with continuous patient care, and No-Tal has really enabled that to happen. You know as well as I do, all the studies say that if you can catch the disease in its earliest stages, and whatever acuity you start out with is likely to predict what your acuity is later at post-treatment, even with the most effective regimen, anti-VEGF regimen. that the patient's vision really isn't going to improve all that much. The idea that we can catch somebody with 20/25, 20/30 vision and maintain them there versus 20/80 is huge in terms of the patient's quality of life. If it's their dominant eye, if they're living a robust retirement, maybe they're whatever it is that they're doing with their vision, or even just a simple task. It really doesn't matter. Just maintaining that functional vision, that quality of life, and that is the gap that this fills in. The goal is to get the patient to the office so that we can do what we do with all of our advanced diagnostics. But because we have two eyes, so many patients don't realize that they're losing vision in the other eyes. So yeah, this has just been such a I would say a comfort, right? Mary Beth talked about her own mom. I think about my grandmother, who really is my inspiration for even getting into the field, who lost her vision to macular degeneration. And I'm like, yeah, we have got to do better. And fast forward 25 years and here we are. How exciting.
Yes, we're here now, but really one of our goals is to help our colleagues understand what's out there to help these patients, because AMD is very unpredictable. If we're seeing a patient every 4 to 6 months because they have intermediate disease, the patients that are lucky, if they convert, maybe they did that a week before they got into the office. What about those patients that I just saw and I'm not seeing them for another 6 months and something happens a month from now? They're not going to have a problem that they're going to notice for several months and probably have already lost vision, and vision that we really can't recover in many cases. So I think having that safety net, that continuous monitoring that you said you're passionate about, I totally agree with that. And I think that this is something that I'm hopeful that our optometric colleagues will adopt for these patients that are at the highest risk for progression to advanced disease. Let's go back a few years, because I know we've all been practicing even before ForeseeHome, maybe even before OCT, most of us. But Barry, in your practice, what are some traditional ways that you would monitor a patient in between office visits if you've diagnosed them with AMD?
So thank you for asking that question. I'm going to just step back for just a moment and just confirm what the other participants said about that early diagnostic ability and why things have not turned out the way we actually wanted them to. And surely science speaks and data speaks. And when we hear that the average acuity being 20/80 before a diagnosis, that surely brings the point home. And we all in practice need to understand that. And we know intuitively that when we examine a patient who has dry AMD, we know they have risks to convert to wet AMD and for their vision to suffer significantly. And we know that if we see them, whether it's every 6 months, every 3 months, or even once a year, we have no idea what goes on between the visits. What are the ways in which we've done it in the past? Obviously, utilization of Amsler grid has been the #1 way, or just telling patients to please monitor their vision, look for any irregularities or distortions in their vision. And if there was ever a question, it's always better to contact us rather than to wait and see if it gets better on its own, which unfortunately that story we've heard too many times over and over again over the years. But there's so many weaknesses in that way to do it. There are problems in terms of sensitivity of tests like Amsler grid, but also we have no idea about compliance, and compliance is a huge problem. Whereas we'll talk more about the technology in ForeseeHome, but we have ways to monitor compliance through the monitoring system. So there's so many advantages that this technology has brought to our practice, and I think intuitively all eye care practitioners should and will welcome this new technology into our clinical acumen. So,
great, thank you, Barry. Let's talk about patient types here. We know that dry AMD is going to affect more than 10 million people in the U.S., and a certain percentage of those patients have what we consider intermediate AMD. And I think that's an important distinction. Dorothy, what's your definition of intermediate AMD? Because those are the patients really that we're going to want to be prescribing ForeseeHome and referring patients to the No-Tal Vision Diagnostic Clinic. How do you define that for your patients?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the research has worked this out pretty well for us. The definitions are out there, but the most simple definition that I follow and I ask my colleagues to keep in mind is if you see RPE changes in the macula and a soft drusen, and really you're in the intermediate zone, right? You now have those high risk features that warrant careful not just steroids, vitamins prescription, but that warrants careful monitoring. And has been stated by some others in this discussion, we can't monitor patients every week, and we know that CNV can develop randomly at any time in those intermediate patients. So having a tool that allows for monitoring in between those visits, really it reassures me, it reassures the patient that they're being well cared for. But understanding what that definition is and making sure that you as a provider understand that what is considered intermediate AMD is very, very important. I do think there are some misconceptions that if you don't have a lot of drusen in the macula, that you're not at high risk, but really, you really need to pay attention to the strict classification and make sure you understand that, so you're getting the right patient to the right device, the right care at the right time.
Thanks, Dorothy. And I think what I try to teach to my students and colleagues as well is that if you see even a single large druse in the posterior pole, that patient's at risk for progression to advanced disease, whether it's geographic atrophy or CNV in the near term. So in this intermediate patient that has soft drusen, like you said, or drusen in the presence of RPE changes in the presence of drusen, their risk is 50% over the next 5 years of progressing to vision-threatening disease. So I think it's a really important distinction between early AMD and intermediate, and I think we have to step up our game as to how to manage these patients, and certainly home monitoring is part of that algorithm for everyone here. Mary Beth, how do you introduce ForeseeHome to your patients so that they understand the purpose of it and what you're hopeful for in terms of impacting their outcome if they are to progress?
And just as our colleagues have said, the Amsler grid is one of those tests that you give the patient, they take it home, and compliance is probably not happening. So what I teach my patients with the ForeseeHome, and I don't talk long on ForeseeHome, I want you to know when the patient's in my chair, that chair time is valuable. So I tried to be quick with this, but when I introduce it, I try to make it like a game. I tell them, this is going to take about 3 minutes per eye. We would love you to do it daily, but no less than 4 times a week, just to give us more data. And it's going to be a fun way for you to kind of monitor your vision. And I think if you set that in the patient's mindset that it's fun and not a chore, they're more likely to do it. I also think that you're going to get better results. And I think you have to let the patient know too, it's okay to fail. Nobody's going to do perfectly on this test, because one of the things that I think happens with patients when they're given this machine is they get frustrated because they might fail. Well, we're testing threshold with the ForeseeHome device. They need to know it's okay that they miss a point. That's the purpose of it. We're testing how far they can see. So quickly I go over, it's a fun game. You're going to do it, hopefully daily, but at least 4 times a week. And it's okay if you miss a point or two, keep going and do your best. That's the purpose of this machine.
Mary Beth, you've talked about how this is, you've put a positive spin on it, which I think is good, is, we've got something that is a fun way to monitor your vision. I don't use that term exactly myself. I just say, I look at more of safety as like, this is a safety net in between visits so that if something changes, I can make sure that we're getting on it right away. But I think we need to take a step back, and I want to maybe swing it over to Barry and just what is happening with the test itself when we talk about preferential hyperacuity perimetry and ForeseeHome. What does that mean in kind of, not getting too technical about it, but what is the device actually doing?
So I'm going to actually probably not answer your question, which probably you might not like, but the truth of the matter is I don't care clinically. To be very frank with you, the technical aspect of this is not really critical to my concern. My concern is that we have a technology that's sensitive and the data is out there in picking up the conversion. It's fairly easy to do. I can tell you that we've done just large numbers of patients, and the number or percentage of patients who aren't able to qualify for reliable outcomes is very, very low, thankfully. So I don't get into the technology in terms of how hyperacuity perimetry works. I don't even use that word with patients. I just tell them it's a very simple home-based technique that will allow you to detect the conversion to more serious macular degeneration that's amenable to treatment, and it can save your vision. And it's a very simple concept to patients. They are totally frightened about losing vision from AMD. I mean, of all the diseases that we deal with, that is number one in our patient's mind in terms of fear of losing vision, because almost all of us and all of our patients know somebody fairly close to them who has suffered from this disease. So I'm sorry I didn't answer your question directly, but honestly, I just don't think it's really a critical point in terms of integrating it into your practice. And surely patients have no interest in how the technology works. So sorry for not answering your question directly.
No, I think that's fair, Mary. The thought that came to me there is our friend and colleague Steve Ferrucci at the podium, in terms of explaining technologies similar to this. He would say, it just works, and I'm okay with that too. So it just works. It works. It's reliable. We'll get into the clinical data in a little bit. Dorothy, do you want to take a stab at explaining to a patient the experience for ForeseeHome and what they're going to be asked to do, so that you can set that expectation up for the patient?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Mary Beth. I like to keep it very, very simple. I actually don't get too much into that detail with the patient. My message to them is really simple. I want you to have this device to check your vision at home, because the condition that you have can change next week, even though you saw me today. So in a very selfish way, I want my patients to know that even though I'm giving them the best care on that day for their condition, that I could still miss this conversion, right? In other words, I could miss what I'm monitoring for, which is an early conversion to wet macular degeneration. And some patients understand the difference between dry and wet. And I do try to explain to them, because macular degeneration is so prevalent where I am. I'm in New England, with this just density of Northern European descent folks. And so they do talk to their neighbor up the road. I have lots of retirement communities. They know that dry macular degeneration may be okay, wet macular degeneration bad. And they think that they're two different disease entities in a lot of cases. So I'm very, very simple in the explanation. I'm like, you need to have this device at home. It's very simple to do. You're going to stick your head into this little device and you're going to respond to it. And it takes very, very little time in the course of your day. And a really nice person's going to call you on the phone and help you run the test, set it up. This is going to be so easy. So I don't get into any of that, quite frankly, because I actually have a lot. I'm so happy to be able to say that I'm 100% confident in what happens when I do the handoff to Notal, right? I know their technicians are fantastic. I know that they understand that their different patients have different needs and different levels of health literacy. And so, yeah, I just keep it simple.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good strategy. And with that in mind, if a follow-up, Dorothy, on that, since it is a simple test and it's covered by Medicare generally, and it's just taking a few minutes for a patient to do you offer this, or prescribe it rather, to all of your intermediate AMD patients?
Yes. So I introduced the technology to all the patients that have intermediate AMD. And most of them are Medicare patients. I do have some patients that are younger. And so I do have some third-party payers that we have to sometimes solicit to have the test covered. But yeah, I offer it to everyone. Most patients will be completely enamored, I would say, by the fact that they can monitor their vision at home. There are some patients, I think, that maybe are afraid of the technology or don't like technology in general, but quite frankly, so many of my patients, if they come in with a cell phone, this is like a no-brainer, right? Which is all of them, and if they have a Kindle or an iPad at home, this is going to be a suggestion. So really it's a rare patient that resists. I do think, as you can imagine, all patients are always worried about coverage. How is this going to be paid? And that's a legitimate concern. But quite frankly, as we all know here on this call, thankfully, this is something that Medicare reimburses.
Yes, I agree. I think that that's the right thing to do. And I would say that I prescribe it for 95% of my intermediate AMD patients, with the exception being patients with dementia, or they wouldn't be able to use a mouse. And I think you can tell after getting to know these patients, which patients are just, it's not going to work for. And that's the most common reason. But I don't really give them a choice so much. I introduce it, but I say, this is what I want you to do. And that this is the best thing I can do to detect change between visits. I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to protect your vision. Patients get it, and you just have to be direct with them. Because of the technology, it just works, that it's the right thing to do for the patient. Mary Beth, do you prescribe this, or do you refer all of your patients with intermediate AMD to No Television Diagnostic Clinic?
I was dying for you to ask, because I agree with you 100%, Damon. I started out, recommending it to every single intermediate AMD patient. And then I found that there just is a population that it's not suitable for. Those who cannot move their hands well, those who have dementia, definitely Alzheimer's. It's just, for those patients, it became very frustrating. And so I've learned better through, time and trials with this, that maybe you need to be a little bit more selective in who you choose. I would love for all of them to be able to do it, but the reality is they're probably ones that we definitely know aren't able to monitor well at home anyway, which is all the more reason why I wish we could. But honestly, I am 100% on your team, Damon. I feel like you have to be a little bit selective with who you choose, but I would love to offer it to everybody.
Yeah, and I would add that I agree with that. When you say, do I recommend it to 100% of patients, I would qualify 100% of the patients who can perform on the test, right? I think that's a really important qualification.
Support for this podcast comes from Bryn Mawr Communications. BMC produces a number of informative podcast series spanning a variety of topics in ophthalmology. Discover a new show at itube.net/podcasts. Support for this podcast comes from Notal Vision, a patient-centric ophthalmic diagnostic services company extending age-related macular degeneration monitoring from the clinic to the home, providing optometrists with remote diagnostic tools to support their patient care. Managed by the Notal Vision Diagnostic Clinic, the ForeseeHome program helps detect wet AMD conversion as early as possible.
Let's go into the patient conversation. We've talked a little bit about this already, both the conversation and the process in your office. And we'll start with Barry on this one. Is the patient comes in, maybe you're seeing them for the first time for a comprehensive exam, and then you've done some screening photos, maybe family history of AMD, but then you determine that this patient does in fact have an AMD diagnosis, in fact it's intermediate AMD. Conversation look like in terms of when you would introduce Notal Vision and ForeseeHome? Do you do that at that initial encounter, or do you bring them back to have a little bit more significant conversation, especially if it's a new patient diagnosis?
That's really a great lead in, and I really thank you for that, because we have those conversations all the time. Predominantly, we will do it at that initial visit. If we've seen what we need to see, we know that at this particular point in time, they don't require any intervention treatment-wise, specifically other than maybe nutraceuticals and that sort of thing, lifestyle management. But at that point, we tell them, listen, you are at risk for conversion to a more serious form of the disease, specifically wet macular degeneration. It's a 30-second elevator speech about this technology. We tell them, we now have technology that you can have at home to take care of watching for any things to go wrong between our visits. It's easy to do, and it's covered by insurance. So our technician will be in a couple of moments, and they're going to set you up to do that. And we have the tech come in, I sign the form, we leave. That is the whole thing. It's just as everybody else said, we're prescribing it. If the patient fails, that's fine, but it's a small percentage. I think that the concept is so easily understood by the patients in terms of the need to do this technology. And as it was mentioned before, the team at Notel Vision is fabulous, right? And we tell them that they're going to be contacted by the company. They will set you up, they will instruct you, they will address any issues that you have. And basically, we're going to know the day that things go wrong, and they will let us know. And immediately, we're going to call you, and we're going to bring you back into the office and make sure, if we need to intervene, that you're going to get the best and most appropriate treatment. So it's a quick conversation. It's easy. People are all about preserving their vision. That's totally what they want to do. And I don't get any pushback from patients. And you guys are right. Surely you have to know what patients would be bad candidates in order to be able to do the test. And Dorothy, you're right. Other than those that you have a real strong feeling couldn't do the test, we recommend it, or we prescribe it, excuse my expression of recommendation, we prescribe it for all of the patients.
Great, and I think that my elevator speech is very similar to yours now, and it really is about 30 seconds. And I think back a couple years ago when I started using the technology is, it was more of a minute or two conversation. The nice thing about Notel is they've got a variety of different patient education tools that you can use, including a video that I would show, 3-minute patient journey sort of video. And to be honest, I'm so confident in the technology and the patient acceptance, and it's very reliable in terms of it. The insurance coverage now it's a 30-second conversation, is almost to the T what you just described. And then I hand it off to the technician to get a little bit of information so we can send that in either via a portal or a fax so that we can get that patient on the technology. Dorothy, how does that conversation or that protocol look in your rural practice with your AMD patients to be able to explain to them why Forsee and then how to actually get them referred to the diagnostic clinic?
Yeah, so I introduce it on the first visit once I've identified that the patient is appropriate and has the ability to use the test at home. I don't really, I'm trying to think, is there a reason I would wait until the second visit? That's almost feels impossible unless there's some extraordinary circumstance that just doesn't allow, for the conversation to happen in the clinic. But yeah, I introduce it right out of the gate. And I'll be quite frank, it's a practice differentiator. I have a lot of patients that come and see me in my newest location who were cared for by other providers. And I have to actually spend a little bit more time being respectful of the fact that they've never heard about the technology before. And I'm like, this is relatively new, but this is the latest and greatest, and I want you to have it, and I want you to have it now. Now that we've identified that you're someone at risk for losing your vision, it's not going to happen under my watch.
And I'll be the contrarian here a little bit. I know that Dorothy and Barry have said, yeah, I do this on the first visit. I'm still an advocate of genetic testing to help understand what sort of nutritional supplement I should be recommending. So if I have a patient, especially if they've never been diagnosed with AMD before, we know that as soon as we talk about macular degeneration, they may not hear too much after that. So I almost break up the visits a little bit. and I'll get all the data I need to make sure that we're taking care of the patient appropriately with OCT photos, etc. And I will make a diagnosis, let them know exactly what that means now and what we're going to do to reduce the risk of this ever impacting their life. And then we'll go over the typical lifestyle modifications. I'll do genetic testing, and then I'll bring them back at like 6 to 8 weeks after, and I'll repeat an OCT. I'll ask them to make sure that they write down any questions they have for me in between visits, and we'll kind of go over some things again, get a little bit more imaging, and then at that point I'll prescribe ForeseeHome, because I feel like, you know, I'm not giving them 6 months before I see them again. I'm giving them 6 weeks. And, you know, again, it's evolved a little bit, especially with COVID, in terms of just being efficient in the practice. You've got them in the practice now. Maybe you do everything you can. But a lot of patients, especially pre-COVID, is I don't want to lay too much on them at once, so that they're already going to be overwhelmed by that diagnosis in many cases. And I think that, again, it's shifted a little bit as we deal with the pandemic. What does that conversation look like in Cincinnati, Mary Beth, with your patients? Give us your 30-second ForeseeHome elevator speech.
So you're right, with COVID, it has been a lot easier to speak on technology like this and to be able to monitor from your home. I'm going to tell you, I split just like you and Dorothy and Barry said. So I'm weird because sometimes I read into the patient and I feel like if they are overwhelmed, then I don't introduce the ForeseeHome device at the initial visit. It's a lot to take in, and I just want them to know the nutrition first and foremost, and I give them an Amsler grid, and then I realize it's easier then to introduce the ForeseeHome device after they've tried to remember to do that, because they don't remember to do that. So on the next visit when they're in, I say, you know, I know you're having a hard time remembering to do this, or when was last time you did your Amsler grid? And it's usually you hear crickets before you hear an answer. And so then I say, I think we need to make sure that we are really watching this. And I do sometimes bring up how the COVID, you know, how we're really on lockdown and only were able for 2 months to bring in those that had changes on their ForeseeHome device. That was the way we did monitor some of the patients. So that conversation now is very easy to say, you know, I want to make sure you're doing this. And if we aren't able to see you for any time frame in the future, I want to know that you're still having this checked and read, you know, by specialists and doctors. And on the backside, we're going to bring you in if needed, even if it is a pandemic, because that's now considered urgent and we want to get treatment in your eyes as soon as possible. So it is still a very quick little talk, but I will tell you my management is very split between how you all do it. And I think every doctor needs to find their own style and what works for their patients. And it might not be streamlined for every patient the way, you know, to talk to them. But that's basically my little take-home speech.
I'm going to jump in just for a second and add to what you were just mentioning. In terms of doing it at follow-up, of course, now with telehealth, that becomes another alternative that you can, you know, schedule a follow-up and without a live visit and go over things in a more relaxed environment. We do that for a lot of areas of management, not just in this particular one, where if you want to have a more extensive conversation, it's very difficult in the office these days, especially. Not only are we really busy, but you want to make sure patients are in and out under this current circumstances, right? So if you want to have that time to have a more extensive, a more relaxed conversation, allow them to think about questions, we find that setting up telehealth visits really is very useful.
Yeah, I think that's really strong recommendation, Barry, and I may have to consider that a little bit more. I've been doing a fair amount of telehealth, but I think that especially these newer patients, and we know the ones that we make that diagnosis and you know they're going to need some hand holding, you know they're anxious. Well, maybe let's just schedule a follow-up in a couple of weeks. They can bring their spouse who maybe can't come to the office now so they can hear, or maybe their son or daughter wants to hear what the doctor has to say. As I think we can utilize technology to have this patient education and then very quickly pivot to use technology to actually do remote monitoring, which is at the core of what Notal Vision has with ForeseeHome. What are your patients say, Barry? I mean, do you have any great success stories, or what's your average patient maybe even that comes in that's using the monitoring? What do they have to say about the technology?
Well, in general, the responses have been very positive. They don't seem to have too many problems. Of course, you know, there are always exceptions. I don't get caught up in the exceptions to the rule because, you know, they're going to happen. Nothing is going to be 100%. it's so interesting to actually go onto the portal and start looking in detail at how the patients are performing and seeing how compliant they are. And you can, I'm laughing a little bit because I'm just thinking about this one patient who's pretty much OCD, and like she's doing it every single day and hasn't missed a day. And then you have the others who are kind of a little bit more lackadaisical. You have to remind them, you're not keeping up with what you need to do, or we really need to get those at least 4 a week done. But the responses have been great. Most importantly, the responses about the team from No-Tel Vision and the support that the patients are getting. Anytime they have problems, obviously from the onset of setting up through utilization, and then being contacted now via emails with updates about things. I mean, that whole system, which is developing and getting better and better almost every month, has been the most impressive part to me. So it's part of a very comprehensive approach that all of us are taking in managing these patients, from education through advanced technologies in our office and now advanced technologies in the home. All of these things are part of a comprehensive approach that I think more eye care practitioners need to embrace in this particular area.
I couldn't agree more. And it's been nice to see the evolution of what No-Tel Vision has done to build out these patient resources and education, and really becomes an extension of your exam room, where I can talk about AMD and monitoring, but they can reiterate when they contact the patient after we prescribe the device. Why is it so important for us to monitor? Why is early detection so critical to your success? So we don't have to do all of that ourselves. No-Tel Vision has trained people to do that. It makes our lives easier. And I think that has been a big pivot here the last year or two, as they've also focused, quite frankly, on marketing this technology to optometrists. We know optometrists have millions of patients with AMD in our practices. And I think that it's been very noticeable. Like you said, almost every month we get something new that's different or better to make this even more valuable to our patients and to our practice. Dorothy, what do your patients say about the technology? Do they like it? Is it tedious? Is it easy? Is it fun? Is it something that is just part of their routine? How do they describe that when you come and see them for a follow-up visit?
I'm not sure I have anyone come in and tell me how fun it is. But, I feel, they will very clearly express that they feel like they have a sense of control, and that this is something that allows them to, do a little bit of patient heal thyself. They really like the comfort of knowing that there's a way that they can participate in monitoring their vision at home. I mean, that's pretty much, the feedback. I have a whole host or variety of patients. One of my favorite patients is a monocular retired physics professor who I did have to have back for a second visit and call him later on the phone to fully explain exactly how the test works. But there's always these exceptions to the rule. But really, patients are just so thrilled to have something at home that makes them feel like they're doing their part.
Great. Yeah, I think that the patient buy-in has been pretty easy. And I would say that was from day one, even thinking back a couple of years ago. Yeah, my process was slightly more involved. It was a 2 or 3 minute sort of conversation, maybe, or we showed them a video. Now it's condensed to about a 30-second and then making a handoff. But patient buy-in is huge because, and obviously my enthusiasm for the device based on the results that I've seen in patient engagement, patients understand that it works, that I wouldn't recommend it unless I thought it was the best thing for them. And I think it's a pretty darn easy conversation now. So I think it's important to briefly review, why ForeseeHome, why did this get approved for patients with intermediate AMD? There's actually part of the ARIDS 2 trial that looked at patients that were having exams every 6 months, and then maybe they were doing an AMSLR or something at home, versus patients prescribed the ForeSee device. And they wanted to see the patients that converted from dry to wet, what was their acuity when that diagnosis was made, standard of care versus ForeSee. And it was actually found that 94% of patients, if they were using the ForeseeHome as prescribed, if they converted to wet AMD, their acuity was actually 20/40 or better. And that was 50% more than patients in the standard care arm. There was actually strong enough data that the researchers said it would be unethical for us to continue this trial because the results were so favorable for the ForeseeHome technology in terms of outcomes that it doesn't make sense for us not to offer this to all of the patients. So with that in mind, and obviously that's strong data to be able to get, coverage for this device and to have the confidence to recommend this to really all of our, or nearly all of our intermediate AMD patients. I want to ask Mary Beth, why do you think that this has not yet become the standard of care? Or honestly, do you think that this is now going to be the standard of care going forward in management of intermediate AMD?
It's a loaded question. I think that understanding that not everybody is going to convert into wet AMD is a big piece of this puzzle too. When people are taking this test and they come in with an alert that NoTel Vision is actually looking on the back end and then sending the doctor the information that there is alert. So the doctor's not always, this is not on the doctor's shoulders. But just when that patient comes in with an alert, I do think it's important to recognize that a lot of the times there's not going to be a wet change. And I think that it's important to recognize and point out to the patient those small changes as well that they may not have noticed. I just want to give you a real quick summary of like what my data was because I know it better than studies. So I did 100 patients and on the television ForeseeHome, and I was really going through and saying, why is it that the MDs, and I'm going to be quite honest, the ophthalmologists I work with maybe don't buy into this as much, and the technology that is, and that's because they're looking for all those to turn into wet. And I think the big thing for standard of care for intermediate macular degeneration, in the 100 patients I did in my first year, and this is just my data, about 40% of those patients came in and they really had changes in their vision, and they were actually more towards the wet form, or I'm sorry, the dry form of macular degeneration, and so it probably was even more than that, but you have to remember I'm in a clinic with already very high risk patients because we're a referral site. 10% of the patients were not able to do the test. That was when I was still learning how and who to choose for the testing. And then those that turned into wet, we had about maybe not quite 60%, but there is a percentage that turns into wet, and those numbers are very skewed. Again, I'm in a very different clinic setting. Now imagine using that in private practice. You want to be able to show those numbers to the patients and make them understand on your own standards even how this has affected your practice and maybe why you would want to continue to use this technology, because it is a little bit of a time in management. But I think it's important to point out that managed care, like the standard of care, I think this is a great tool to use for the standard of care because it does catch things so much earlier, because it does catch changes that the patient's not recognizing. If they come in and they really are not noticing that they have a change in vision, but they've dropped 2 lines on the chart right there's first your information. You can always do an OCT. Autofluoresce is my jam. I love autofluoresces. They really show where there's changes that other people might not be able to show. And then also, if you're lucky enough to have fluorescein angiogram, you can show the changes on there as well to the patient. Because again, remember, it's not always going to be about a wet conversion as much as a change in vision and managing the dry continuing going forward.
Great. I think a lot of insight there. And I want to ask Dorothy about this too and get her take. Is if someone's having home monitoring and they get an alert, what happens, and then how is that patient managed in your office?
Yeah, so I agree with Mary Beth. I think one of the questions that we're always challenged with in practice, and there's a reason we call it practice, because the more you do it, you hope the better that you get. Right now, I strongly feel that this should be part of the standard of care of taking care of patients at a minimum with intermediate macular degeneration, because we don't have as much information as maybe we would like on who those specific individuals are that might convert, right? And so that's what standard of care is about. I mean, standard of care is just that. It's a guideline. You have to individualize that to your patients. But having said that, this is a visually devastating disease, and we now have really good studies, such as the one that you mentioned earlier, that make it very, very clear for those patients who do convert, the detection is so much earlier. It would be crazy for us not to, it would be, right up in there with unethical not to prescribe the device. I'm a big fan of looking for the genetic correlates and testing patients in that regard in the office, as you mentioned yourself. But we still have a ways to go in zeroing in on who specifically are those patients. And one day we will actually be able to identify those patients with much more precision. We've all heard that term, precision medicine. It's a real thing. It's coming. But until we get there and until we refine algorithms, until we can really truly individualize medical care, we have to look at what is the cost benefit of this, right? What is the cost benefit to that individual patient and to society? I mean, vision loss is an $80 billion dollar take. Comparing that to the cost of potentially over-prescribing a continuous care device, I think that's the ultimate question that we have to ask in our individual practices and as professionals who are the ones that have been challenged with advocating for saving vision. To answer your specific question, which I may have forgotten by now, after, as you can tell, this is a subject that I'm passionate about. The process is really simple for patients. I'll give you an example of a patient that actually had a positive hit, right? So they had a positive hit, but they didn't actually have a conversion to wet macular degeneration. So I got the call, I got the email alert. Then I got another, I think there's like different ways you get alerted, and I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. And this was actually a patient who I always have in my mind, who I was very worried about. And it just turned out, and I called her on the phone, and she was out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean sailing with her husband. I'm like, fabulous, but get off the boat. She's like, no, I was really bad. It was me. I know it was me. I didn't do the test right, and I kind of didn't follow through, and I know I was doing it inaccurate. I'm fine. I'm not getting off my boat. So, you're going to have those things happen, right? All technology is still dependent on the human interface, at least for now. But having said that and using that outlier example, when you get an alert, it's a serious thing, and what a fabulous opportunity to follow up, whether it's a true positive or not. And I would say those are definitely the exceptions to the rule. This is not, an untested technology. It's highly accurate.
Yeah, and you can have disease progression and it still be dry, and it's going to show up on that test. And that doesn't mean that, if someone comes in and there's an alert, it's always a good thing, because we've detected progression. We're going to manage it appropriately. If it's progression and it's dry and they don't need to have an injection, even better. If they've converted to wet, we're going to catch them much earlier. And I think that, that makes me feel really good about offering this in my practice. And that's really what I want to have our final topic about is, does offering technology like this in your practice, is this a potential practice builder? I mean, there's not any direct revenue coming into a practitioner for prescribing ForeseeHome or referring patients to the diagnostic clinic. But Barry, what does it mean to a practice to be able to embrace something like this in terms of just the outlook of your practice and what your patients think about what you have to offer?
For sure, I agree with you, David. It is a perception issue here as well. And all of us on the call tonight, I think, kind of practice, even though our practice environments are different, I think philosophically we must be very, very similar. And we're really into advanced technologies. We're the early adapters, we're the innovators. And so we bring technology into our practice, and it tends to define the practice. And I truly believe at our practice, many patients are at our office because they believe they're getting cutting edge care, whether it's the technology we use or the treatment modalities that we prescribe for patients. So I think this is critical. And as I've mentioned a number of times tonight, it is a critical part of a comprehensive approach to the management of age-related macular degeneration. And we too incorporate genetic testing. We too also measure levels of protective photopigments and prescribe appropriate supplements. We have the OCT, we have the, all of the technologies that are important in the management of these diseases. And I do believe this is critical. The issue of standard of care, I think that ties right in with the company's now dedication to bringing this out to optometry. I've kind of consulted to a bunch of folks at the company over the past number of years that I thought they needed to do that way at the beginning, and their approach towards retina specialists might have been a lot of work with not as much return, although I surely approve and appreciate that if we get buy-in from our retina specialists, it makes our life a little easier. But I think to create standard of care, we're going to have to get this into the hands or at least awareness of lots and lots of optometrists. And I think it will resonate with many, many of us in our profession. And then it will become standard of care, I believe.
That's great. And I think the retina specialist buy-in is mixed. I think it depends what part of the country you're in. But I do know that retina specialists like optometrists like having great outcomes. And they would much rather treat a 20/20, 20/25 wet AMD than have a patient that's 20/80 or 20/200 before they start getting their injections. I think we can all get on board with this. Final thoughts, Dorothy, in terms of the technology and its importance to AMD management going forward?
Yeah, I'll just underscore again that, I think this is the future. I think this is the way that we will care for patients, not just with macular degeneration, but perhaps even with other disease states that threaten central or macular vision. So I'm excited that we've brought this into our practice. I have great comfort in knowing the fact that my patients have access to the latest technology, and I really look forward to the next generation iteration of this, quite frankly.
Yeah, exciting stuff. Mary Beth, final thoughts?
I didn't get a chance to comment on how great the company is to work with, so I want to go back and circle to that. They really do make it easy. The only way I would ever be able to continue recommending this tool is if it was as easy as just saying, look, there's somebody reputable on the other end of the phone, and if you ever have questions, call them, because that means the world to me to know that this technology is so accurate. It's great. I mean, it will even catch if an epiretinal membrane is present in macular degeneration, be on the lookout. It might be the epiretinal membrane that the actual machine is catching too. It's that accurate. And I want to just say that the people behind the scenes are just really great at caring for our patients, just as you would hope they would be cared for. So I hope this moves forward and continues to move forward. And I look for great things from this company too. Thanks for having me on board.
Yeah, it's been great working with Notal, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with my forward-thinking colleagues on this session. And it's a great thing for our patients. It's a great thing for our practice. We all want better outcomes. We have great agents if someone does convert to wet, but we got to find those patients. We got to find them early. And we know that baseline acuity when they come in is actually going to predict their acuity over the next 5 years when they start therapy. So I really think this technology that has become standard of care in our practices hopefully will become standard of care throughout optometry as people understand the importance of early detection and home monitoring. So thank you, everybody. It's been a great chat, and I look forward to future conversations.